Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the national security reporter at the Wall Street Journal, Nancy Youssef.
I'm looking forward to a really exciting and enlightening conversation. In August 2021, the United States began its final troop withdrawal from the 20-year war in Afghanistan. In the aftermath, the Taliban swiftly secured its hold on the majority of the country, catching the United States flat-footed and creating weeks of disarray as the U.S. and its allies scrambled to evacuate both citizens and at-risk allies alike. Conversations surrounding the specifics of the evacuation will no doubt take place, but there are broader, more strategic questions upon we must also reflect. There are concerns among many that the abrupt and seemingly chaotic close of the so-called forever war will have long-standing repercussions both for the ability of the United States to project power abroad and will negatively affect the relationship with our allies and partners who have been by our side for almost 2 decades. The outcome also brings to bear questions of the U.S. role on the world stage and the trust that is required to sustain strong and long-lasting partnerships with our allies. This panel will reflect on these questions and will ponder 2 major themes. What's next for the United States, and where do we go from here? Joining me virtually are Ben Rhodes, author and former National Security Advisor, and George Packer, staff writer for The Atlantic. And here with me on stage is Dame Karen Pierce, Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the United States. I'm Nancy Youssef, and I will be moderating today's conversation and later opening the floor to questions. All right, let's get started. George, I wonder if we could start with you. You've been a long-time observer of this war. When you think about how it ended, what are your major takeaways? What kind of Afghanistan did the coalition leave behind? And what does it mean for U.S. standing in the world?
It ended badly. I'm hearing a pretty glaring echo, which is distracting, but I'll try to speak through it. It ended badly. It ended chaotically without an obvious plan for how the United States was going to. I can't speak while hearing myself echoing simultaneously, so I don't know if the technical people can solve this problem before I go on.
Why don't we give them time to do that, and then I'm going to take a piece of what you said and pose it to Ben. This idea of a chaotic withdrawal. You know, one of the things we heard from President Biden is that it was inevitably going to be chaotic and that was an unavoidable scenario. You sat in the Situation Room where these decisions are made. From where you sit, was it inevitably chaotic? Were there things that the United States could have done to mitigate some of the scenes that we saw in the final days of the war?
I mean, I do think that in any circumstance where you have a withdrawal like that, and you are rapidly losing whatever limited control you had over events over the course of that withdrawal, to some extent, yes, there's going to be a degree of chaos. And frankly, part of what contributed to that was that the U.S. military, seeing that precise risk, really pursued a fairly accelerated timeline in terms of getting out, prioritizing the safety of their personnel. I do think if you look back at this, you enter into a circumstance where the Trump administration has already made this agreement with the Taliban to withdraw. Then you have President Biden making the determination in April that we needed to be out by the fall. I do think more could have been done with that time period between President Biden's announcement and the evacuation that we all witnessed with many of those chaotic and tragic scenes to evacuate Afghan allies and to essentially change the nature of the mechanism through which you're evacuating them. We were continuing up until the fall of Kabul to remove people from Afghanistan under the CIV program, the Special Immigrant Visa Program. And clearly that program was nowhere near sufficient to accommodate the hundreds of thousands of people who are at risk. And so given the speed with which the Afghan security forces and government collapsed, perhaps not that surprisingly in the midst of our withdrawal, but faster than was expected, I think clearly the time between April and the evacuation itself, continued to make use of an existing bureaucratic program that was already slow, that had been crippled and paralyzed by the Trump administration. And then that contributed to the fact that you had to try to do in the period of a week or two what you normally would have tried to do over a more extended period of time. And so to me, that was the thing that I think the Truman community and many others obviously kind of scrambled into gear when Kabul fell. That's the kind of thing you'd like to have done more planning, gotten more people out in a better environment so that it didn't all come to the forefront at the same time.
I want to ask you a quick follow-up on that, because you described sort of logistical challenges and structural problems within government. But the argument we heard at that time between April and August was that to evacuate too many too quickly would lead to a panic or a set of actions where the government would have fallen faster. From where you sit, is that a legitimate argument? And how do you balance sort of the political implications of a withdrawal with the logistical challenges that come with it?
I mean, I understand that argument. On the other hand, if you consider we knew how many people were at risk, and we knew the increased danger to them presented by a U.S. withdrawal. I think the kind of competing messages of our military is getting out, but our State Department is here to stay. Frankly, we have a human obligation, a moral obligation, an ethical obligation to people who've not only served with our military, but to people who we knew were in danger, because those who were civil society activists, those who'd worked on women's rights, those who'd worked on human rights, they'd been targeted by a brutal assassination campaign for a period of years, even before the announcement of withdrawal, before the deal with the Taliban. So these people, there was an ongoing risk. It wasn't just simply a risk introduced by the withdrawal of U.S. forces. So I think on balance, you accept the reality that the biggest message we are sending, far bigger than any assertion of a continued diplomatic commitment to Afghanistan, is the withdrawal of our U.S. forces. And that's, by the way, a strategic decision that I support. But I do think that one of the characteristics of the entire war, across all administrations, including the one I served, was an insufficient centering of the policy in the experience of the Afghan people themselves. And I think part of what was so tragic about the whole period of the last several weeks is that the end of the war compounded that central flaw in the entire war's execution, that the Afghan people themselves were not put front and center in terms of consideration relative to other U.S. interests. In this case, the interest of U.S. forces getting out as quickly and safely as possible, and the U.S. seeking to communicate a diplomatic message about its enduring commitment to Afghanistan. I think if there's something we take away, or one of many things we take away, it needs to be that in the launching of the war, the waging of the war, the policies associated with that, and then when in the withdrawal, the Afghan people were not elevated to the same degree of prioritization as other U.S. interests, and we saw the result.
Ambassador, I'm so thrilled that you're here because you represent a country that was one of the top allies to the United States throughout this war. And I'm curious, from where you sit, how did the withdrawal look to your nation? Did you feel that your nation was adequately involved in the decision-making process when the president announced it? How did the U.S. policy affect the UK's force posture and its thinking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Truman Center for having me here. I might say that I was the ambassador for the UK to Afghanistan from 2015 and 16, and I also worked on the military campaign immediately after 9/11. After 9/11 and the immediate response, we went in as NATO to Afghanistan, and that fact kind of has governed the last 20 years, and it governed the evacuation and the decision to withdraw. So NATO took a decision that we'd all gone in together, we would all come out together. One of the consequences of that, though, was that we were, as Ben was saying, there was a very fast military logic, and it was difficult within that to map out what the future presence would be, particularly a diplomatic presence. At that time, before the Taliban had actually got right into the center of Kabul, there was speculation that we could keep Western embassies open and that they would agree to that. And so we were, in effect, asking for a slower timetable for the military forces to withdraw so that we could map out all those diplomatic questions. In the end, as we know, things speeded up. The Taliban did take over, and we were left with the evacuation. I want to underestimate what the evacuation achieved, and it was a fantastic operation to get out over 100,000 people, and a large part of the credit for that goes to American forces. And when the Prime Minister was here recently, he thanked the President for what the American military had done, and of course we were proud to work alongside them. We ourselves managed to evacuate 15,000. The emphasis now is on getting out those who we sadly had to leave behind. We're looking to the Taliban to grant them safe passage. We're also working with people like the Qataris so that flights can go in and people who want to leave can do so.
You talked about how the military withdrawal forced a shift in the diplomatic presence of the United Kingdom in those final weeks of the war. How are you thinking about the diplomatic presence in Afghanistan and going forward?
I'd actually, if I may, Nancy, I'd say it was the other way round. It was the Taliban takeover of Kabul that forced the shift in the thinking about keeping embassies in Kabul. It was not certain we could get the guarantees of their safety that we would need. What we're doing now, we have moved the British Embassy to being a representation in Doha, in Qatar. And from time to time, our chargé d'affaires, Dr. Martin Longdon, who was my deputy when I was in Kabul, so really good to see him at the centre of this. And the Prime Minister has appointed Simon Gass, who used to be our ambassador in Tehran and also was the NATO senior rep in Kabul. Simon is his High Representative for Transition, and they travel from time to time into Kabul and hold dialogue with the Taliban about all these arrangements for safe passage, for getting people out. They talk about human rights, particularly the rights of women and girls, and the absolute importance of getting girls back into school. They also have discussions about terrorism and how we don't want to see Afghanistan revert to being a safe haven for terrorism. And they talk about humanitarian aid and assistance and under what circumstances some of the restrictions on Afghan funding and financial assets might be lifted. But it's a conversation that's only just started, and we haven't taken any decision about the future.
I see. George, I hope your technical issues have been resolved, because I'm very eager to hear what you have to say about several things, including the following topic. You know, one of the things we saw in the immediate days after the U.S. withdrawal were terror groups around the world celebrating what happened as a victory for the movement broadly. Moreover, we've now seen an Afghan government that has a heavy presence of the Haqqani network and al-Qaeda affiliate. And I'm curious, from your perspective, how did this war reshape terror groups? And how does the U.S. need to adjust its planning to stop those groups from seeing this war as a galvanizing point to move forward, to expand their operations?
Well, first, I want to go back to
Please.
what I'm going to have to mute myself on my own computer. I want to go back to what Ben said. Can you hear me, Nancy?
Yes, we can, beautifully.
Yeah. I want to second everything Ben said and add a little bit to it, because I think in addition to not centering the Afghan people in our policy throughout the war, the entire 20 years was marked by wishful thinking and self-deception. And in that sense, the end of the war was of a piece with the rest of the war. For months, the Biden administration was told by outside groups, refugee advocates, veterans groups, and many others, that there would be a catastrophe if the country fell quickly as it might for all the Afghans, whether SIV applicants or others who were stranded, who were left behind. And there were all kinds of ideas for how to get them out sooner. It wouldn't have been massive, highly public airlifts, but it could have been something a little quieter and more subtle. But nonetheless, there were lots and lots of ideas, and the Biden administration spent months sort of looking at those ideas, but also not coming to any decisions about them, and finally was caught completely unready when Kabul fell in August. And so I think that was a kind of wishful thinking that really caused the lack of a plan. That was the key thing in August. There was no plan for how to get people out. And so it was improvised, and the improvisation was a remarkable thing because, as Ambassador Pierce and Ben said, it really did involve both U.S. and NATO forces, but also all kinds of private efforts from around the world, including by the Truman Center. So that, in some ways, saved the Biden administration's bacon. Without those outside groups helping Afghans to get to the airport and to link them up with troops inside the airport, most of those people who were evacuated would never have gotten out because they wouldn't have been able to find a way to a gate. So it was a weird public-private effort that we've never seen before, and in a sense that I hope we never see again, because it was improvised in the absence of a plan, and that lack of a plan was due to a kind of blindness, a willful blindness on the part of the administration to not want to think too hard about what the withdrawal was going to be. I would call it an America First withdrawal, where we put our own safety and interests not just ahead of, but in place of the interests of the Afghan people and our obligations to both them and to our NATO allies, who have been complaining sometimes privately and even publicly that they were not adequately involved in our decision making and in the suddenness of the events of August. So I just wanted to throw in my bit about the withdrawal itself before we move on, because I've been thinking about it and talking to a lot of people about it, and I think it will stick with us as a really dark moment in American history. Even though the public has moved on, we can already feel it's in the back, it's receding behind us. I think history is going to remember it, and Americans will remember it, and a lot of Americans turned out to care a lot about Afghanistan. I think that's something the Biden administration didn't count on. How, after 20 years of war, a lot of Americans, including many who were probably part of this conference, were involved with that country in ways that the end of it felt like some kind of a betrayal of that involvement and of the debt that we owe to the Afghan people.
Well, let me ask you this, and I want to open the question to everybody. But in some measure, the final days of the war, or the war itself, were driven by wishful thinking, as you say, then what say does the United States, what read can it have on Afghanistan? How can it shape events going forward? Can it shape events? We're talking about not recognizing the Taliban unless it meets certain conditions. If it was that disjointed while there was a heavy presence, can the international community have a big impact on the outcome going forward? And if not, then how do you figure out economically how to support the Afghan people who are stuck between an international community that doesn't want to recognize the Taliban and an economic situation on the brink of collapse? I'll start with you, Ambassador. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
It is something we need to think about very carefully. The Italians chaired a G20 meeting the other day of leaders to look at this precise question. The international community has taken a decision, beginning with G7, that we will do this moving forward with the Taliban in concert. We'll judge the Taliban by actions, not words. We are very interested to talk to partners about exactly the dilemma you mentioned. Humanitarian assistance, so to help people absolutely desperately in need, will go on. the Afghan economy itself needs a lot of support. But at the same time, we don't want to desert the women and girls who the international presence helped enable get to school, get the healthcare they needed, get the lives they wanted to have. So it's about a balance of talking to the Taliban regime in place at the moment and setting out the circumstances under which Western assistance is prepared to flow. And, you know, at one level, the Taliban say they don't want people to leave Afghanistan. They don't want a brain drain. And that's understandable. But the remedy is in their hands. If they make Afghanistan an attractive place for Afghans to live in, then there won't be a problem about assistance because people will be able to go about their daily lives. They will be able to go back to work in safety and security. Women and girls will get the health care they need. Girls will be able to go to school. So we do hope that the Taliban will see that very important connection.
You described walking a very thin line. Ben, George, I'm curious if you see a way for that to be successfully implemented.
I mean, look, I'd say a couple of things here. I think, first of all, to step back, and this is one reason I think to be supportive of the overall decision, there's kind of a presumption that the military presence was, on balance, achieving the ends we sought in Afghanistan beyond counterterrorism ends. It's certainly the case that in places like Kabul and in other parts of the country, the U.S. military presence facilitated a much greater degree of rights for Afghans, particularly women and girls, so I don't want to diminish that at all. The other reality, though, is that even having a military presence, we had a deteriorating situation. We had a really violent situation in huge swaths of the country, and you had a Taliban that had been ascended for some time. And so I do think it's worth stepping back and questioning the assumptions that often govern our military presence in other countries that kind of equates that as the only mechanism to try to advance our interests. Because the reality is, not only was that military presence not stabilizing the entire country, and frankly, there was a deteriorating trend line in terms of Taliban control of the country even before the withdrawal, but it's also coming at the expense of other things you're doing. And it's also not necessarily contributing to an effort to reduce the threat from terrorism. When you look at the growth in terrorist movements that accompanied the presence, that has accompanied the presence of U.S. military forces, whether it's in Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, I think the Biden team understandably wanted to move this into a different era. And that's not even to get into the other issues around the world that they're looking at. I think with respect to Afghanistan itself, look, I do think it's a bit of a false premise to suggest that we now suddenly face the question of whether to engage the Taliban. The Trump administration literally negotiated directly with the Taliban for years, leading to an agreement with them that cut out the Afghan government to withdraw our forces. The Biden administration was clearly negotiating with the Taliban on the ground to facilitate that evacuation. So this isn't a new question. In fact, we've already been engaging the Taliban steadily for years. I know that there's something different about a formal diplomatic recognition. What I would be doing, though, is thinking, for once here, what can and should we be doing to help the Afghan people? They're facing a humanitarian crisis. They're facing potential food shortages. They're facing all manner of other challenges. We should be providing humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. We should try to do that in ways, if we can, that don't flow directly through the Taliban. But what we should be trying to identify are what are the humanitarian needs and how can we help to meet them. And that, to me, should be the overriding priority. And I'm glad it was. It seemed like that was very much what was on the minds of leaders at the G20 summit and President Biden and other leaders' comments there. Because ultimately, the political dynamic in Afghanistan, look, if the Taliban cannot govern, if the Taliban function as an insurgency but fractures as a government, as it very well may, if the Afghan people who've had a capacity of experiencing a different kind of life for the last 20 years demand more for their government, that's something that's going to play out over many years. I have no optimism about the Taliban itself. What I do suspect is that they're not going to be capable of governance, that there are going to be internal pressures, and that the United States should try to continue to have direct engagement with Afghan civil society. And frankly, there's going to be a massive Afghan diaspora in places like the United States and the UK. But I think in the immediate term, this should be a humanitarian-focused policy for us. And that should include providing assistance in whatever ways we can that directly reaches the Afghan people.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask one question that we promised at the beginning of the panel, and I think is one of the most important ones given everybody here. I'm going to ask you, George, to start on this question, and then I'll take it to you, Ambassador, which is how does this war shape how allies think about working with the U.S. going forward in the future? George, I wonder if you could address it broadly, and then Ambassador, if you could address it specifically to your country.
The ambassador said that we went in with NATO, and that's true. And it was the most important event, really, in the history of NATO. But ever since we went in, we have essentially treated our allies and our partners to some degree as secondary, as useful at times, and a hindrance at others, or just as irrelevant, and including in the early years when there was offers of help from other NATO countries that the Bush administration flat out refused to accept because they wanted it to be American dominated. And again, I think the way we left sort of represented something of that thinking in the lack of consultation and the fact that things took our allies by surprise. And I think we shouldn't deceive ourselves. Our reputation has taken a big hit. Our reputation for competence, our reputation for reliability toward our allies and toward people who staked their lives on our promises, and our reputation for caring about the things we say we care about. President Biden wants to put human rights at the center of American foreign policy. He wants a summit of democracies. It's going to be hard to imagine how those are going to be credible to the rest of the world after a withdrawal that, as I say, looked like an America First withdrawal for which Afghans and our allies were afterthoughts. So I think there's just a tremendous amount of hurt and damage that we are going to have to face and begin to undo and repair, and not imagine that we can just walk away from Afghanistan and from the way we left Afghanistan because we are proud of having a number like 120,000, which is a slightly fishy number since it includes everyone who left the airport under any circumstances at all. So let's just be realistic about how much of a blow this is to our reputation, and begin from there rather than from simply declaring we're back again after a little setback in Afghanistan. I think it's bigger than that.
Ambassador, how does your country think about it?
I have a slightly different perspective from George. I think the headline is, it's where the Deputy Secretary started. America is the indispensable nation. And if Boris Johnson were here, he would say it's overwhelmingly in Britain's interest, but also that of all open societies, that the US remains a force on the world stage, leading the way, championing open societies and open markets. And that isn't changed by the Afghanistan decision. I do think there are some interesting lessons learned for NATO on different aspects of the operation, some of which goes to what George was saying about the way decisions were taken. You know, I worked on the Balkans conflict, I've worked in Afghanistan, both NATO operations, decisions taken differently. So I do think NATO could probably benefit from doing a study into what exactly are the lessons of intervention and nation building that we've learned as a result of Afghanistan. I do agree with George that we now need to be very careful that certain groups of people, one can think of other countries, neighbours of Afghanistan, one can think of certain jihadi groups, don't draw the wrong lesson from what they've seen by this withdrawal. I don't think it has the same negatively transformative effect that I think George was alluding to. If you think that 15 years after the withdrawal from Vietnam, fall of Saigon, America was back in Desert Storm, I think it would be wholly wrong for countries or movements to draw a conclusion about American resolve from what they've seen in Afghanistan.
I'd like to open the floor to questions. should be a microphone headed your way.
Hi, thank you all so very much for this really enlightening discussion. My name is Kendall Salcido. Something that businesses talk about in the mining sector is this idea of responsible exit. Like, you know you're going to leave, so when you leave, how do you do it responsibly? And there's this premise that we left Yemen irresponsibly, we left Vietnam irresponsibly. Comparatively, Afghanistan is less irresponsible. I wonder if you're aware of any efforts to contemplate responsible exit for in the future, for the ways that we could systematically withdraw without. Thanks.
Thank you. Who wants to take that on?
I can try.
I'll say something about that.
And I'll have you come.
We have a habit of leaving badly. We have a long history of it, and of leaving people hung out to dry. I disagree about Vietnam being a worse case than Afghanistan. That if you read the accounts of how we left Vietnam, it was chaotic. We all know about the helicopters from the rooftops in downtown Saigon. What's less known is that for weeks and weeks before those helicopters, there was a massive effort on the part of U.S. diplomats, military, CIA, and civilians to get Vietnamese out of the country. And it had been going on almost under the radar, and in some ways against policy, breaking rules for weeks before the ambassador in Saigon, Graham Martin, and Henry Kissinger in Washington finally accepted that there had to be a sudden evacuation, and that's when the helicopters came in. But before that, tens of thousands of Vietnamese had been leaving the country, and in the end, it was 135 or 140,000. So in some ways, there was a willingness to think ahead and to see the desperation, to use imagination that I don't see in the Afghanistan case, where it had been sluggish and bureaucratic until the very last minute.
Ambassador?
I think exit strategies are always really important. And now I don't think we'd ever do an intervention, any of the NATO countries, without having at least an outline of what an exit strategy would look like and what success looks like, and then what a contingency plan looks like if you find you're not on track to achieve the success you want. And if you don't do that, then it's very hard to evaluate whether you should actually intervene in the first place. So I suspect that will be one of the lessons learned, and I suspect that will be something we build in going forwards. There is a particular difficulty in Afghanistan that you didn't get in the same way with the Balkans. You can chart troops going in the Balkans in 1995, which was a heavy NATO presence. Then there's a reduction. Then you get the EU presence, and then you get a more of a civilian mission. One of the big problems with Afghanistan, I think, was that we didn't do enough on the law and order side. So not the terrorism side, not the military and security side, just basic law and order, anti-corruption in the villages, in the provinces. And I think that is a critical lesson that we need to learn for the future, because, to be honest, we always forget about law and order. The UN has peacekeeping. Its law and order side is much less well established. And I really hope that as a result of Afghanistan, the international community can take a proper look at that, because it actually turns out to be the key to so much that affects ordinary citizens as opposed to geopolitical factors.
That is, it's the keystone towards an exit strategy.
The key for ordinary citizens to buy into the fact that their lives will get better, and therefore that you can have political and economic development in a country that's coming out of conflict.
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for your thoughts on this particular issue. My name is Justin, And I'm with the State Department, and I actually spent a little time on the ground in Doha leading some of our evacuation efforts there. And I remember a time standing out at Al Udeid Air Base in 105 degrees, and every 45 minutes, a C-17 full of 400 plus Afghan travelers landed. And within a matter of hours, we were triaging thousands and thousands of Afghans on the ground. It took the might of the U.S. government, the military, our allies, our partners, the Qataris, and doing some of the work that we did there. And it was phenomenal to be a part of that experience. And we called it our miracle in the desert, in working for some of the efforts that we did there. And many of our allies and partners in the Gulf did very similar work. So my question is, similar to what my colleague just asked, is we've got a lot of stories about what we did. And we've struggled, I think, over the history of our country and the world to capture these stories in the right way. Not politicize them, but capture them so that they're honest, they're accurate, and they reflect how we move forward as global citizens so that we don't repeat these same mistakes. So my question to you, outside of the books that will be written, outside of the panels that we will continuously have, how do we, or in your suggestions, how do we capture this story so that it is accurate and that it is honest and it is fair? Because there will be generations of Afghans here in the United States that will think back on how they landed here, and they will think back to the work that we've done. Will they have the stories, and have they been captured appropriately so that we learn from our mistakes and we can build a foreign policy apparatus, both with our allies and internally, to prevent something like this from happening again, or if it does, that we can do so with boldness and with true grit and power that we're able to do this to protect and save lives around the world. Thanks.
Ben, I wonder if you'd be willing to take on that question.
Yeah, no, and first of all, look, I want to express a lot of admiration and gratitude for every American who was involved in the rescue effort. Again, these critiques of mindset and policy, none of that applies to people on the ground doing incredible things. And look, I think stepping back, you asked about story. One of the things that's so complicated about the United States and that I think gives people around the world such a contradictory views about the United States is that they can look at a country that would use its capability to and put its people in harm's way to try to get as many people out as we possibly could in those final days and see an incredible generosity of spirit. And then they can also see a country that again, is for 40 years had a military involvement in Afghanistan that too often didn't show the people those same sense of humanity that we were showing them in that period of evacuation. And that's because America is a big and complicated enterprise. American democracy is, as we experience every day. American foreign policy certainly is. It encompasses all of these different contradictions. And listening to this discussion, you know, I think the overall point here, and at Truman in general, is how do you have a democracy in this country and a foreign policy abroad that reflects, yes, a hard-headed assessment of American interests, and it's a tough world out there, and sometimes you have to do tough things, but reflects that aspect of the United States, manifests in the stories that you personally experienced in trying to help Afghans. We have these questions about exit strategy. Well, one way is to not get into these wars in the first place and have a foreign policy that is more anchored and rooted in that sense of common humanity that we experience with the Afghan people. I do think it's progress. The one contrast I draw with the Vietnam exit that is preferable is that part of what Nixon and Kissinger did is to try to demonstrate American credibility by an incredibly ferocious pace of bombing leading into the exit. Millions of people killed. We didn't do that this time. There's been an evolution of the norm of the extent to which the United States would essentially just try to destroy a place on the way out. I'm making that point to say that another good point that was made about the Desert Storm being 15 years after Vietnam. Well, the end of the Cold War was also 15 years after Vietnam. And that was really a triumph of a belief in a better set of values than what the Soviet Union represented as much as anything else. And so to me, the question going forward is we do need to move on to big issues like democracy in the world, like China's not only threats to the United States, but threats to democracy in the world, like the climate crisis. And I think how do you infuse American foreign policy and American politics with the story of Americans who see the common humanity of people on a tarmac in Qatar or an airport in the United States, that's the America that the rest of the world wants to believe in. And frankly, when it comes to allies, when we demonstrate that through our policies, through our priorities, people want to work with us. And they'll want to work with us whether or not the war in Afghanistan ended badly, if they're seeing that from the United States. And so to me, it's about, yes, preserving those stories for posterity, but also giving expression to those stories through what we do in our politics here at home and around the world.
Can I say, what I hear in the audience...
First of all, Justin, thank you for the incredible work you and your colleagues did to save Afghans. I've been traveling around talking to refugees in the United States, and they are incredibly grateful, and they will be the most excellent American citizens. And I've also talked to Americans in local communities who've welcomed them, and the outpouring of generosity is inspiring, and it should remind us of the best face that we can turn to the world, as Ben was saying. I think when you ask about stories, the thing that we're facing now is how to imagine an American role in the world that is neither the indispensable nation that it was for, let's say, the 30 years following the end of the Cold War, nor the America First that became our foreign policy under Donald Trump, and that I think in some ways there's still a bit of a hangover of that in the Biden administration. Is there another way for us to be in the world and to see ourselves without the reflexive turn to militarism and to interventionism that we had for 30 years, nor the turning inward and turning our back on both humanitarian and human rights concerns and our allies and people around the world who still look to us for support and inspiration in their own democratic struggles? I think that's a major challenge. We haven't had that before. We don't know how to think of ourselves in that way. And whether that's a story or a policy, it's something that we have to, our best thinkers and practitioners really have to put their mind to a way of seeing ourselves that is new, that we've really never had before, because we oscillate so wildly between intervention and isolation. That's been our history throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Is there another way to be in the world that is more constructive and more attractive to others?
That world, that sort of alternative, George, is it one that is more multipolar from where you sit then? Because I think that's always been the reticence, right, to relinquish the U.S. position as a dominant power. Does that middle ground look more multipolar, do you think? Or is it just more nuanced?
I think the reality is that the desire to preserve hegemony, there was something artificial about the period of time after the Cold War. At no time in history does a nation have that level of dominance sustained without people challenging it. And we, through our foreign policy post 9/11, through the Iraq War, through the financial crisis, through our political dysfunction at home, have certainly made it easier for Russia to disrupt a system rooted in American hegemony, and for China to emerge, ironically, very much through the system we built of globalization to challenge the United States. I think there's an inevitability to that. And that it being a superpower that tries to resist a multipolar world, that's kind of how you get into trouble in history. That's how you get overextended. Sometimes that's how you get bigger wars that people didn't want in the first place. So I think what America is navigating is entirely what George said, which is, look, we used that moment of unipolarity. Unfortunately, in my view, the biggest project of it was a military project that was rooted in a post 9/11 desire for a kind of total security and a kind of total control over places that we didn't fully understand. And that was an enormous mistake that history is going to unpack for a long time to come. But I think when we go forward, look, America can be an indispensable nation in marshaling collective action. What is a big project out there in the world today that requires collective action that only America can help catalyze? I would say climate change and dealing with the climate crisis is the kind of project where the United States engaged in a multilateral, multi-decade effort to transform the global economy to be able to both deal with the effects of climate change and to slow and mitigate it. I think which doesn't mean compromising our values. I think the United States saying that there is a competition of models in this world, that military force and military budgets are not the only way that we measure that competition, but that the United States and other democracies wants to demonstrate that we're better able to deliver for citizens, but that also there's something intangible and universal about human rights that we want to hold up into contrast with the kind of systems that Russia or China represent. And that the expression of our support for democracy is not through military intervention. It's through how are we solving problems in our society? How are we managing the explosion of technology? How are we regulating social media? How are we protecting the rights of our citizens? Another problem with this post-9/11 era is that I think democracy itself got kind of attached to American military interventions in other countries because the rhetoric that justified those interventions often drew on this. So I think America just has to get back to its better story. And frankly, all this is going to be expression of what happens here. And so the biggest thing for the credibility of the United States in the world and for allies wanting to work with us is to not have a politics that looks like the politics of the Trump era. If we can preserve our own multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy as the foundation of what we do in the world, that's going to be the best expression of what we can do for human rights and democracy. That's ultimately what's going to allow the United States in a kind of more multipolar world to be a more attractive model, not just kind of what are we doing in other countries.
I'd love to hear another question because they're so great.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Angelique Young, and I actually used to run the Afghanistan police program for several years for the State Department. So I'm deeply familiar with some of the failures of the effort related to law and order. And I really want to touch on, because I hear people talking about gathering stories and lessons learned and letting those hopefully in some way dictate how we behave in the future. And my recollection when we began that program back in 2001 is we had lessons learned in front of us, and we knew the kinds of things that worked and didn't work, and we made the decisions we made anyways. So my question to you is not so much how we gather those lessons, which I think we know, right? And we have known for many years what it takes to have commitment and will. It's how do we change the will? How do we change our hubris of each, administration thinking that they can do this thing that every other administration before them has failed to do? How do we change that will in the way that we see ourselves in interventions in the future?
I think it's a fascinating question. Ambassador, I'm going to pose it to you because you've worked with multiple administrations and seen some of these conflicts. I'm curious how you think about that, the applicability of these lessons such that they're enduring and not fleeting through an administration or a term or a conflict.
It's a really good question, and it's a very difficult thing to do, having been guilty myself of some of that. It's not even so much about the will as having the lessons learned come alive. I think there's something very important about challenge sessions in policy making at every single level. There's something very important about getting outside voices in, whether they're think tanks, whether they're journalists, and just having people ask really critical questions that forces the people making the current decisions to have very good answers. I know I've read all the books. When I went to Afghanistan, I spent a lot of time reading about the Northwest frontier and just how many times the Brits have been kicked out of Afghanistan. But you're right, it doesn't stop you, because you always think you might be able to do better. And I don't want to be too pessimistic about that. Sometimes you really can do better. But there is something about having a critical assessment every step of the way that's very important, and that, I think, is what we tend not to do. I do remember one episode where a decision was taken to do a certain type of military operation in a certain order, and I remember back at the ranch, as it were, we said, well, why is it being done in that order? Most difficult to most easy. Why isn't it being done most easy to most difficult? I don't know which is right, but the point is there wasn't an opportunity for debate and discussion, and I think in some ways that's the most important thing we can do going forwards.
What I hear in your answer is that it's really about the infrastructure or the organizations making the decision, that there has to be an element of accountability in the decision-making process such that it's not about what happens on the ground, but the decisions that lead to the deployment of troops, of diplomats to conflicts, if I'm hearing you correctly.
I think that's exactly right. I think there's also something very important about being ready to go back to first principles. So often we take a decision, we go down one avenue. Something happens that causes us to rethink that decision. We go back to the previous decision. We don't always, in my experience, go back to the fundamentals and say, are we on track to do what we set out to do? Do we need a more radical change of course? And I genuinely think tanks, journalists have a really important role there, but good to draw you into the discussion early.
I want to take one more question because they've been so wonderful.
Great, thank you. My name is Mark Nebb. I'm a former naval officer, current law professor. I have a question specifically about intelligence failure and George Packer's comments about wishful thinking. Is it more that the intelligence community failed to envision the rapid collapse of Afghanistan, or is it more that the intelligence community at some level were envisioning that this could happen, but their voices were drowned out or not taken seriously? So just specifically the role of the intelligence community in failure to envision what happened.
I don't think we can know quite yet. I think there's going to have to be a fair amount of reporting and research and history before we can be sure. But my reporting tells me that the balance of this is that there was intelligence. It was obviously presented as a range of possible scenarios. And the most pessimistic, which didn't seem like the most likely, was never taken very seriously. It was never factored into planning, which is why there was no plan when everything fell apart in August. And I don't think that, just as in every other administration on Afghanistan, it's not as though we were blind. We had intelligence. It's just that there's a habit that seems ingrained in our foreign policy apparatus to close ranks around a scenario and intelligence that leads to a policy that is what the policymakers want, and then to begin to exclude the others until it is no longer professionally all that advisable to keep insisting on it. And we've seen that throughout this war. The Afghanistan papers in the Washington Post show the extent of that self-deception. It is almost never a case of we didn't know. It's almost always a case of we didn't want to know. And I think we'll probably find that the same is true in the months of leading up to the collapse of Afghanistan.
Ben, you've gotten those intelligence assessments and had to sort of figure out where to place them in policymaking. This is, I imagine, one of the few times you're an outsider looking at something this consequential with the experience you had and sort of reading the tea leaves. George makes a great point that it's going to still take time to kind of make a proper assessment. But I'm curious, initially, from what you saw, based on what you know, was there an interpretation you had one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, look, based on my experience, I want to speak up for the intelligence community here, which I don't always do. But like in this case, when I was in government those 8 years, they were consistently the most pessimistic and realistic about Afghanistan. And it was usually the military that was the most optimistic for understandable reasons, because they're the most invested in what they're doing. And frankly, the intelligence community had a lot of impact on my own calculations during the Obama years that there was a very much lower limit on what we could achieve than I think what had been envisioned at the beginning of the war and even the beginning of the surge. I think what we make a mistake, and we made this mistake in the Obama years. You know, George talks about the mistake of not listening to the most negative voices, and that is one piece of this. Another piece, though, is the intelligence community is not predictive about, you know, when we want them to tell us, is this government going to fall in how many months, or how many months can the Afghan security forces hold out? The reports that kind of leaked out, right, or that came out, were that there was an assessment that in 18 months the government would fall to the Taliban, or as little as 6 months in some assessments. Well, look, if the intelligence community is telling you that the Taliban is going to win the war, and if that is public information, and if you know the Afghan government is corrupt and has money stashed away, and you know that Afghan security forces know that the balance of the war is going against them, you can piece that together to say, hey, this might happen a lot faster than this kind of predictive model turns out, whether it's 6, 12, or 18 months. This is the imagination point. And when you make a deal with the Taliban that excludes the Afghan government, as the Trump administration does, and says, hey, we're going to withdraw completely from this country so long as you don't shoot at us. And we're going to cut out the Afghan government. But we hope that the Afghan government fights you, who we just cut a deal with in a civil war, to make this look less bad so that it goes on for 6 or 12 additional months and we can do some evacuations. That is a crazy premise for a policy, right? And so it's not the intelligence community's fault that a deal with the Taliban that withdraws all U.S. forces and then the execution of that withdrawal would lead to a collapse. That's not on the intelligence community. And so I think we got to get out of this loop of expecting the intelligence community to predict with precision what is going to happen on what timeline in these other countries. It's the job of the intelligence community to lay out what is the trend, where is this headed, what are the important things you need to know. And it's frankly the job of policymakers and Congress, by the way, who are the ones who stay throughout multiple administrations and often escape these kinds of conversations, to be responsible for how to process that information. So in this case, yes, I mean, I think you should go back and scrutinize it. But I mean, the intelligence community has called this pretty straight for a long time when not everybody else was. And so on this one, I think it'd be a mistake to push this down onto them. And frankly, one of the lessons learned should be we shouldn't expect the intelligence community to tell us exactly what's going to happen in however many months in countries that I couldn't predict what's going to happen in American politics in 6 months. Like I couldn't tell you when they're going to vote on the Build Back Better agenda. And yet we're asking the CIA to tell us what's going to happen in 9 months in an incredibly foreign country. So I think we have to adjust what our expectations are.
Well, I have to tell you, I can't believe how much we covered in such a short period of time. I could talk to you guys for hours. I'm sure you don't want to sit for hours, but I would enjoy it. And I want to thank you all for such thoughtful questions, because I think it was such a critical part of what was, I found, a really engaging conversation. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our esteemed panelists for such an interesting conversation. Thanks,